Welcome to this, our latest in a series of webinars and in-person colloquia held through George Washington University Law School. My name is Chris Yukins. I'm a professor at George Washington University Law School. We're very honored here to be in the offices of NATO DIANA in London. This is our first international series where we will be meeting today here in London, then we'll be meeting in Paris tomorrow and Milan on Friday. And we're very grateful to our hosts here for having this meeting here in the DIANA offices, and we're of course very grateful to Google as well for making the facilities available for us to do it, both the electronic facilities today on Google Livestream, and then of course for hosting us in their offices in Paris and Milan over the next few days. What we're talking about is a very, very hot issue. Procurement for innovation. It's a very important issue on around the world. A lot of what we'll be doing is comparing what's going on in the United States to what's going on in Europe. So both sides of the Atlantic can gain from lessons learned. Again, thank you very much for joining us. We have 400 registrants for this program, a very large group from many countries, well over 100 countries. So we're delighted that they could join us. About a third of our participants, registrants, are from the United States. So we give you a sense of how important this topic is on both sides of the Atlantic. Do we have the next slide, please? So I'm the Lynn David Research Professor in Government Procurement Law at GW. With Jessica Tolman, who'll be joining us as our associate dean, joining us on Thursday and Friday. We run these programs on a regular basis. The recording will be available through Public Procurement International and also be available through the GW Law YouTube page as well. We have the chat open, so if you have questions during the course of our session, please feel free to put those questions into the chat. And I should note that the speaker statements today are in their personal capacities. Next slide, please. So today we'll be talking about defense and security issues. On Thursday, we'll be talking about global developments in procurement for innovation. And on Friday, we'll be focusing more specifically on European developments, drawing on some studies that have been done through the European Union. Each of the sessions is the same time. So today's session is at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 1400 hours here in the United Kingdom, 1500 hours in the Central European time. So we'll have the same time on Thursday and on Friday as well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through quick introductions of our speakers, and then we'll talk about the contrasting EU, US, and NATO approaches and NATO DIANA approaches. And then tomorrow's session, as I said, we'll be talking about global developments. Next slide, please. So first we have, in terms of our panelists, first Tom McSorley, who is the General Counsel here at NATO DIANA and an old and very dear friend. Tom's the General Counsel where he's responsible for developing DIANA's legal strategy and managing the organization's legal risk. He partners with DIANA's Commercial Challenge Program and Accelerator Delivery teams to ensure cohesion in DIANA's efforts between the demands and realities for innovative businesses seeking to operate in a highly regulated environments, the requirements and expectations of the investor community, and the processes and structures of public sector and defense organizations. He also oversees the organization's security function and collaborates cross-functionally in setting DIANA's approach to IT services and systems. I should also note that Tom helped us set up the IT today, so he's an expert at IT here at DIANA. Prior to DIANA, Tom spent his legal career in both private practice and in-house. He was previously a senior associate in the global law firm Arnold & Porter in the government contracts and national security practice. In full disclosure, I'm a counsel there. He's counsel at SpaceX, and most recently he was deputy general counsel of Rebellion Defense, a startup focused on software for defense applications. He was an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center and a fellow in the Law Center's Center on National Security. He holds an AB in government from Harvard University, an MA in education from American University, and a JD from Georgetown Law School. We also have Alex Rogers, who's here with me in the room. She's Chief Operating Officer of the jHub Catalyst team, the innovation branch of the Ministry of Defense's Cyber and Specialist Operations Command. In support of jHub's efforts to connect defense users with innovative solutions, Alex leads programs that share lessons learned and tools across the Ministry of Defense here in the United Kingdom. Prior to joining jHub, Alex was selected for the competitive Fast Stream program, ultimately bringing her significant program management experience to the MOD as Digital Transformation Program Manager. Alex was also a reserve soldier in the British Army. She holds a Bachelor's of Civil Engineering from Durham University. She'll be speaking with Tom and also with Ryan Benitez. Ryan is the Chief Commercial Officer of NATO DIANA, where she's responsible for leading the organization's industry and venture capital engagement strategy, building pathways to commercialize and scale dual-use startups across NATO member countries. Her focus is to drive growth and adoption of emerging and disruptive technologies in both the commercial market and in the hands of the warfighter. Prior to this post, Ryan worked across national security, venture capital, and technology acceleration. She's advised and invested in early-stage companies throughout her experience in venture capital and scaled accelerator programming for the U.S. Department of Defense and the Department of Energy. She began her career as a U.S. Navy officer, leading operations at sea and abroad. National security innovation have remained central themes throughout her career, with particular focus on bridging the gap between startups and government to deliver cutting-edge capabilities at speed and scale. Ryan holds a master's in business administration from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and master's in security studies from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. We're also joined online by Professor Luke Butler, who's a very old friend at the University of Nottingham. He's Professor of Public Procurement Law and Regulation, the Director of the United Kingdom's only executive program in public procurement law and policy, and head of the UK Public Procurement Law Unit within the Public Procurement Research Group at the University of Nottingham. Nottingham is very much a sister program to our program at George Washington University Law School. Professor Butler is an international authority in defense and security procurement regulation and works as a consultant to ministries of defense, international organizations, and industry in this highly specialized. His publications include many books and articles. Besides his work in public procurement law review, I should note that Luke wrote his thesis on the transatlantic defense industry, and it really is one of the world's few experts on the trade issues that come up in that transatlantic defense market. We're also joined by Ed Boulay, who's the head of legal at Google Cloud in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa. He's the senior counsel, as I noted, and manager of that group at Google. He advises on strategic projects and transactions with partners and customers in the public sector across that region. Before that, for 10 years, he was an attorney with the firm of Herbert, Smith & Friels, both in London and Tokyo, where he was a corporate and commercial solicitor specializing in the technology, media, and telecommunications sector. Ed, I really want to thank you for being an extraordinarily good partner with us as we put together this international program. Thank you for your patience and for your help. Okay, next slide, please. So first, I'm going to talk quickly about what's happening in the European Union. There's some very important developments in this area. Next slide, please. The first, a starting point for understanding some of the themes that we're going to see recurring on both sides of the Atlantic is the Draghi report, which was for the procurement community and for the European Union, was very, very, very important in setting benchmarks and goals for how the European Union could move forward, including with regards to defense companies. Importantly, the Draghi report called for protectionism to nurture the European defense industry, so that as we think about strategies for moving towards procurement for innovation, protectionism in order to foster industries internally is one of the options we'll be talking about. Next slide, please. The next was the letter report that came out in April 2024. The letter report didn't call for protectionism, called for U.S.-centered policies and procurement to drive forward the European single market. It called for procurement strategies that would align public spending with broader goals, especially in innovation and sustainability. We're going to see that in just a minute in terms of how the European Commission has responded to this issue as it reforms the European procurement directives. The report called for strengthening of administrative capacities in procurement to advance effectiveness and accountability. So another theme we're going to see over and over again is the idea of strengthening the procurement workforce. Next slide, please. So the European Commission, as part of the process of reforming the procurement directives in the European Union, the European Commission recently published a retrospective on the 2014 directives. And that, as you can see in this chart here, this chart is that the snake picture is actually a timeline. That's a response to the public consultations And it's really a retrospective, looking back with and commentary from our fellow professors, Willem Janssen in Holland and Roberto Quaranta in Italy, contributed to this, as well as the experts that you're going to hear from on Friday, contributed to this report. Really, the report tried to get a sense of how successful the European Union's directives, 2014 directives, were in accomplishing certain goals. Next slide, please. One of the most important of those goals, of course, was innovation. And what the European Commission concluded was that the 2014 directives were not terribly successful in driving forward innovation. The response from the European communities were that more could be done to use procurement successfully to drive forward innovation. You see in that third bullet there, you see some of the issues that were identified, which are issues that we will be returning to again and again and again over these 3 days. The most pressing issues identified: explaining the low uptake with regards to innovation, or the absence of clearly defined legal bases running public procurement for innovation, lack of flexibility in the legal framework. That's something that Tom will be talking about from DIANA's standpoint. The lack of capacity, professionalization, the risk-averse mindset of public buyers. Very important element of moving forward and making it better, making public procurement a better source of innovation in the broader society. A lack of standardized tool and templates to ensure compliance with the legal framework, and persistent ambiguity surrounding audit and compliance procedures. So can public procurement for innovation really advance rapidly if there's a compliance mindset? So these are topics and themes that we're going to return to again and again as we try to think about possible solutions to make procurement a better function for innovation. Next slide, please. So just last week, the European Council published legislative guidance moving towards reform, not of the 2014 general directives, but rather reform of the 2009 Defense Directive. And the European Council's the direction offered by the European Council is very, very important to understanding not only how the defense reform might occur, but in a parallel track, how reform might occur in the general procurement directives as they're reformed. The Council emphasized that the EU is determined to strengthen its long-term competitiveness and keep its economic, social, and environmental objectives intact. So one of the things that we're seeing here again and again in the EU that you don't necessarily see in the current environment in the United States is a re-emphasize of environmental objectives. So how do we make reform work with regards to the environmental objectives as well? How can we mesh them together? And the current administration is not focused on green procurement in Washington, but a future administration might be. So figuring out how we can do innovation through procurement, but at the same time recognize environmental issues is an important piece of the puzzle. In many ways, lessons being learned in the European Union will be relevant in the United States if a future administration takes up the cause of green procurement again. Importantly, the European Council called for a simpler regulatory framework, which is a theme that you're going to see in just a second in the United States. Again, the Council would call for liberalized technology export controls. In the weapons area, export controls has been a very important issue. ITAR issues with regards to the use of U.S. weapons technology, and the idea that the Council's idea is to liberalize trade controls within the European Union to try and help move forward the European defense industry. The Council also called for greater use of a negotiated procedure. So this would be potentially a negotiated procedure without advertisement. So the Council's pushing on the defense side for simplified and more rapid procurement methods. And from a political standpoint, and this is important for transatlantic relations, explicitly the Council said discussions regarding the so-called European preference, which is a question whether or not there be a European preference in defense markets, that was deferred until the revision of the procurement directives next year. So you're seeing the Council deferring this sensitive political issue about a European preference until after the directives are reformed. Next slide, please. So we are on Friday going to be here. I'm just going to touch on very briefly here that we're going to be seeing two members of the Corvus team will be joining us, including Stephen Corvus himself, talking about a report that really assembled views from experts around the world, including on a pro bono basis. I contributed to this. Legal barriers to innovation procurement across the EU. And we're going to get to hear about this in much greater detail on Friday. Next slide, please. I'll talk just very quickly about what's happening in the United States. And this is what I'm focusing on here is, next slide, please. It's a proposal put forward by Roger Wicker, who's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator Wicker he's one of the two most powerful senators on the Senate Armed Services Committee. His counterpart, Jack Reed, and he have played a very active role over the last few days. You may have seen them in the international press discussing what's going on in Venezuela. He put this act, the Forge Act, in. He dropped it in on the last day of the last Congress. And the reason he wanted to do that was he wanted to signal the Forge Act, and I'll be talking about some of the most important provisions in that would be included in this year's National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act in Title VIII is the primary vehicle for statutory procurement reform in the United States every year. The Armed Services Committees push it forward every year as the authorizing committees for the Defense Department. And he wanted to signal what are some of the reforms that he considered most important. We don't have time to go into the hundreds of potential reforms. I just want to talk about a few salient ones that Senator Wicker, Chairman Wicker, put forward. Next slide, please. So as a backdrop, one of the things that Senator Wicker is very sensitive to is the fact that interest payments on the debt in the United States are now exceeding national expenditures on national defense. This is a inflection point politically in the United States. A real concern that enough is being spent on the national defense, and that compared to what's being spent on the national debt. Next slide, please. The response is what here in Europe would be called the public-private partnerships. How do we bring private capital into defense spending? This that comes from the Forge Act report. This chart reflects the sensitivity of the fact that while there was substantial private capital that came into the defense market, it's possible that won't be there if the defense regulatory structure can't be sufficiently updated, modified, streamlined in order to accommodate the demands of private capital. Next slide, please. So I want to talk just about three reforms. And so what you're seeing here is an emergence of really interesting reform ideas that might be interesting in Europe as well. The idea here is that we're trying to exchange ideas between the two systems. And so one of them is what Senator Wicker referred to as procurement for capability. He said, so for example, if you have a capability like develop drones, instead of trying to work that from a 400-page proposal and a huge solicitation, instead having a more rapid process, one where a group of contractors were brought together to innovate, to develop alternative platforms, and allowing them within this structure, this broader and more flexible structure, to allow them to move forward in developing that capacity without having to reapprove documentation or change baselines. Very much the NATO DIANA model that you're going to hear about in a few minutes from Tom. The next very interesting is breaking the government monopsony. This is something I've never seen. I mean, in nearly 40 years in federal procurement, I've never seen anybody from the inside attack the government monopsony. The idea is to say that different program managers would be attacking a similar goal, and they do it with fixed budget. And you go, wow, this is completely crazy. Why would you artificially constrain the budget? This is a Prustian bed. Why would you do this? So it's the ultimate bureaucratic solution to what should be a non-bureaucratic problem. The answer is that the individual program officers, these program officials, would have the power to break the rules. So when they start to approach their caps in terms of the monies available to them, they would be allowed to break the rules as necessary in order to achieve the goals. Very, very interesting and innovative approach. The last is, and this is revolutionary, in American procurement, whether or not it's a price-based contract or a cost-based contract. Normally, technology development is done on a cost basis, that the contractor is allowed to recover costs. There's concern that the cost basis is a bad idea. There are other reforms about that. that it tends to slow development down. But at the same time, also, when assessing price, traditionally, contracting officials have looked at the cost to see whether or not the price is reasonable. The proposal here is instead to consider prices we do when I buy a car, when I buy a new Toyota, the amount that I pay for that Toyota is not driven by the costs that Toyota incurs in producing that Toyota. What the price I pay is on the value. How much do I value this Toyota? That's what drives my purchase decision. And essentially, Senator Wicker has suggested that same thing should happen, especially for emerging technologies from non-traditional government contractors, that instead the government should be assessing the value to the government. This is a revolutionary idea because it really untethers the price analysis, but it is an important insight on bridging this gap between the private sector and the public sector, which have been, since World War II, really been very much divided. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to talk about a presentation given by Secretary of War Hegseth just this last month. Next slide, please. Because the themes that Secretary Hegseth emphasized in that speech, Rebuilding America's Arsenal of Freedom, were themes that we see again and again. You're going to hear Tom talk about in just a minute in the discussion of what NATO DIANA is doing. So focus on more rapid delivery of weapons. The idea is making acquisition officials and program managers accountable with metrics. Pressing for more foreign military sales. If you think about it, while we've already talked about the use of private capital to drive defense procurement, foreign military sales are, from the United States perspective, are really using foreign governments' capital to drive weapons technology development and production. That's where that focus comes from. That's how it links up with the other initiatives we've been talking about. Other transactions, I just want to spend just 2 seconds on other transactions, because you're going to hear it referred to over the next few days, and it's important. It's a completely goofy American term. What the heck is another transaction? Is this transaction? What the heck is another transaction? Doesn't make any sense. Well, other transactions means that it is a procurement really written against a blank slate. It's a special authority based on agencies' organic authority to enter into contract grants and other transactions. And other transactions, as is understood in the Defense Department, more broadly across the United States government now, other transactions is tabula rasa. You really start from scratch, which is great in terms of flexibility for the private sector, but many of our students are contracting officials, and those contracting officials are frankly terrified as they go into another transaction situation. So it creates a lot of risk, because instead of using 200 years of development of procurement terms, they really have to start from scratch. And it's a very controversial area, but it's an area that allows the government to accommodate emerging technologies much better. The goal is to unlock private capital and cooperate with industry. And we have a number of professors here. Mikhail Kania is joining me here. The number for the professors, this is a very important development. While historically the Defense Acquisition University, which is it's a major force, it's about $200 million budget every year. The Defense Acquisition University has focused on compliance training, really rules-based trainings. What Secretary Hegseth called for is instead a focus on creating leaders. And what we do really in our program is for focusing on critical thinking. How do we make our students better critical thinkers in order to be better actors in the procurement community? And that's what Hegseth is pushing towards for the broader defense acquisition community. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom, and I'm going to enjoy these wonderful maple cookies that have been provided to me. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining. So we wanted to take a few minutes here during the panel to talk about specifically on what DIANA is doing in the procurement for innovation space. So I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with DIANA. I'm going to talk a minute in detail about what we're doing for what we call rapid adoption, which is the NATO term for transitioning, I think is the term in the US, new capability, new technology, sorry, I should say transitioning new technology into capability. So how do you get the technology that's coming off of the lab bench and into early products actually onto the battlefield and into the hands of the warfighter. So DIANA has a very interesting and unique vantage point in aggregating demand from across the alliance, having the authority to go out and seek innovative solutions to problems we're identifying. And then, really relevant for this discussion, we have the authority to facilitate the rapid adoption of those new technologies into the defense customers' hands. And so we see our role at DIANA as an alternative pathway we're sort of funded by the whole alliance, by all 32 NATO countries, and our role is to have that higher level vantage point when it comes to innovation, and then to support adoption, and where, again, relevant for this discussion, where there is not a existing authority within a national system to facilitate the acquisition of an innovative solution, we want to fill that gap, be kind of the quick deploying bridge from one side to the other to support that. And then that acquisition can be sustained there are NATO procurement agencies, the NATO Communications and Information Agency, or NCIA, and the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, or NSPA, that do outsourced procurement for NATO countries, and we partner with them to transition the prototypes that we develop at DIANA into programs of record. So if we go to the next slide. Major General Paul Payton, who is our military deputy director for North America, he had set out in a discussion a few months ago, I think, a really nice set of objectives for what DIANA is focused on. So, and you can see here, number one, operational impact. So really, we want to be finding those innovative technologies and integrating them into capability development, rapid prototyping, which is something we're going to come back and talk about, shifting the culture. And I think this gets to the discussion that Chris just had about both European and US efforts to change, in some ways, the mindsets and the approach to risk when it comes to acquiring new capability. Normalizing collaboration, so that's something that's very important to us, obviously, as a NATO agency, is how to build collaboration across allies. One, because it leads to efficiency in development of capability, and number two, because it spreads risk, so that you share costs among allies in terms of technologies that could fail. And then finally, and we'll only briefly touch on this, although it's interesting that you see across the EU and the US defense reforms reference to this, is we are also building a network of trusted capital. And as part of the DIANA program, we are focused on supporting or facilitating, to the extent we can, the commercial success and the access to private capital for the innovators that come into our program, because it's in everyone's interest to have the technology developers that are developing these solutions that are going to have a major impact in defense and security, as well as across civil society. We don't want all of that technology development, or maybe much of that technology development, to be funded by the public if there's a private market for that technology. So the idea here is that we can identify that technology, support and back its development, but to the extent possible, rely on private investment and private customers to sustain the iteration of that technology, so that it's available, but it basically drains less of the public coffers in order to access it. So we go to the next slide. Sorry, next slide again there. Oh, now here I am. Okay, next slide. All right. Okay. So there, if you go onto the DIANA website, or if you read about DIANA or see materials we put out, there's a lot of different ways that you can think about DIANA depending on your vantage point. But for this discussion, we're focused on DIANA's efforts in rapid adoption. And that is facilitated by what we call under the DIANA Charter, the Rapid Adoption Service. So DIANA has a number of elements to its program, but a key element for sort of at the end of the DIANA pipeline is the Rapid Adoption Service. So the way we're going to talk about DIANA today is to look at the end of its pipeline and talk a little bit about how we get there to the end of the pipeline, and then what that structure looks like. So if you see on the left there, what is the what are the key benefits of the Rapid Adoption Service? So number one, and I think this, if you look at a lot of what Chris just talked about, and a lot of the interest in quote unquote procurement for innovation, we have among the 32 allies just an unbelievable amount of talent and effort and expertise in terms of developing all of the technology, and I say that literally, that is necessary to protect us, to increase our defense capability, probably to dig our way out of the worst case ecologically, to make us healthier, right? I mean, there's just an incredible amount of technology developing. When it comes to defense, a big piece of what the problem we're trying to solve, and Alex, we're talking about this in a couple minutes because Alex is on the ground in the UK solving this problem, is how to align this supply of talent, of technological talent, with demand. And it turns out, and you can see in the discussion of the proposed reforms, it's actually quite difficult to tell technologists exactly what we need or think we need, and that problem is both because of all the myriad process that you need to follow to do traditional procurement. It's also because we don't exactly know what we need. We know the problems we have, but we don't necessarily know what we need. And so if our procurement system is structured around a very traditional model where you put out a tender for something you need, but we're not sure what we need, the results aren't that impressive. And so really the crux of what we're doing at DIANA is we're identifying the problem sets that we're aware of among the alliance, and we have a fantastic vantage point to do that because we're able to talk to the 32 individual sets of capability developers and planners, as well as the NATO level unified planning process and capability processes, I should say, and identify, okay, where are the problem sets that aren't being solved, and then we can share those in an unclassified way in an open setting with the teams, the technologists, the innovators, as we call them at DIANA, who can potentially provide those solutions. And I think it's very it's a small anecdote, but sums up kind of the one of the main problems we're trying to solve. Is I was at a conference about a year ago, and a guy approached me, and he was a serial entrepreneur. He'd been very successful. He was feeling patriotic. And basically said, look, I've done a lot of businesses. I really want to help in the defense space. I think you talked about what he saw happening in Ukraine. And he said, I've got this team of software engineers, and there's about 15 of us, and we are committed. We sort of put together this little group. What do you need? I said, it turns out it's not that. I don't have just a quick answer. It turns out it's hard. It's actually hard. So the first thing we do at DIANA is we try to, through our challenge program, explain what are the key problem sets. Then through the Rapid Adoption Service, and this is thanks to the agreement of all 32 allies, we have the ability to do rapid prototyping contracts. And so this is based on, this is not a new concept. This is based on some of the structures that fall under that other transactions authority that Chris talked about. We also have modeled it off of, in Europe, some of the innovation structures, including a kind of competitive dialogue structure to basically say, okay, bring the innovators in, work with them to understand the problem, and then get them under contract to start delivering prototypes, because when we talk about risk, right, and you hear this a lot with innovation, oh, you know, there's this risk of going with a non-traditional or a new company. It is certainly a risk if you have a startup company and you say, here's $400 million, go build us a thing in 6 years. That there's a high possibility of failure just handing that kind of task off to a startup and letting them cook. But if instead you work iteratively with the startup to prototype, to test that prototype, to provide feedback, then you can get into a process where there is small r risk, but you're identifying the successes and the failures on a much faster pace so that you can redirect or you can cancel your efforts. So that's the concept with rapid prototyping. And then there's the scaling piece. What we have the authority at DIANA, and this is thanks to a lot of efforts across the enterprise, and again, modeled after thinking in across the alliance, if the prototypes work, we are able to transition them without further competition to a procurement contract through our partner agencies. And so the idea here is if we get all the way to the end of this dialogue or the end of this prototyping process, and we actually achieve a benchmark of a thing that the alliance needs, we don't have to then stop and run a new competition because we've already run that competition at the beginning of our challenge. And so this is a way of delivering what has been honed onto the battlefield. So if we go to the next slide. This is just sort of a nice illustration of what we do with challenge formation, which is we basically identify myriad needs. We cluster those into areas of alignment under our strategic direction, which is given to us by our board on the kind of the technology areas to focus on. We then align those and put out challenge calls that basically describe scenarios and problem sets and get fantastic innovators. We've had over the first 3 years of the program, we just are finished literally at the contract stage of our third cycle. We've had over 7,500 proposals across our challenges, and now we're bringing in our 270th company will be coming in this December. So we're signing everyone up right now. Next slide. And so here is an illustration. Everyone loves a flow chart, right? So here's an illustration of how DIANA works, and the flow chart got a little wonky. The arrows have gotten truncated on the Google projection, but I think everyone can kind of see what's going on here. But essentially, we aggregate those capability needs. We form the challenges. We do that competitive selection. And by the way, when I say we've run a competition, I just told you the numbers. We spent, for example, this year over 8,500 person hours evaluating in a very rigorous way the proposals that have come in for solutions to the problems that were identified. So that is an investment across all 32 allies. That's why we're very confident in and insistent on the authority to then be able to take the solutions that come out of this competition and get those delivered to the battlefield. We don't want to spend another 8,000 hours to keep recompeting, right? And we don't need to keep running process. We've run one really powerful process, and that's setting us off to the races. We then have our challenge program, and that includes, if you look along the bottom, an accelerator program that helps educate the startups on all of the myriad of compliance issues. So one of my passions is export controls, and those are certainly important if you're in the defense market. Traditional, again, procurement model where you've got one single proposal competition, you've got a whole compliance checklist. That's very difficult for a startup to achieve all of the compliance requirements. Instead, we act as a kind of on-ramp, so we work with the non-traditional companies on their solution. At the same time, we also give them time to ramp up in terms of security requirements, IT, compliance, etc. We then have, and I'm sorry about the use of acronyms, which I generally ban at DIANA, but here we are, TEVV, which stands for Testing, Evaluation, Verification, and Validation activities, as well as OPEX, which is Operational Experimentation. So we basically get these solutions quickly into test centers, to the extent we can, out into exercises, operational exercises, semi-real world settings to see how they work, to get real feedback, and then to iterate. And then the rapid adoption service comes in, which is in that gray box. And essentially what that is the authority then for our stakeholders, the allies, to pick up the solutions that are most promising and issue opt-in contracts to do prototyping, set the benchmarks for those prototypes, work to validate those prototypes, and then if we reach a validated prototype, as I said, we go to the green box where we can actually deliver sustaining procurement contracts to get those solutions into the right hands. And I'm very excited that we now are close to 6. So we've had this authority for about 5 months now, 6 months, with our second cohort, and we now have 6 very active prototyping contracts coming out of the program. So we are demonstrating this can work. We go to the next slide. So now, that's the theory. Ryan is coming in. She's handling another stakeholder meeting, but we've got Alex here, who's been sitting here very nicely, but who has been in the field at a UK organization called jHub, which I'll ask her to talk about. First kind of how jHub works and kind of the lessons you've learned at kind of the UK level on, through jHub on how to actually get success when it comes to bringing non-traditionals into the market.
Cool. So the jHub first, I'll just explain. It's been around for about 7-ish years. It was set up in 2018, actually based off a visit to the US, where our then commander of Strategic Command saw the DIU and thought, we need something like that over here that actually takes novel technologies and puts it into the hands of the end user. That was when we were called Strategic Command. We're now called CSOC, which is the Cyber and Specialist Operations Command. So basically, it's the 4th command that includes all of the cross-cutting capabilities. So you've got intelligence, med, operations, special forces, and a bunch of others, cyber, EM, things like that. And basically, it's evolved over the last 7 or 8 years, but fundamentally, the principle is the same. We demonstrate the potential value add of new technologies and new solutions by running trials with end users. So we can work on pilots in any of those areas that CSOC covers, but our projects always have an engaged end user. Whether the project starts from a user bringing a problem to us, which is our preference, that always has like the best pull through, or we see a novel technology and we go and find a user, or we get directed to look into a specific technology area or specific problem space, and we will go and find that defined problem and the solution. But we always make sure there is an end user engaged. They set the success criteria, they set the parameters of what we're testing and how we're testing it, and they run the trial with us. Because there's no point us in the ivory tower of the civil service saying that this would add value to a warfighter or an intelligence officer. We need those people to be in the room and actually tell us whether it will give them a better day to have this piece of equipment with them. I'd say what we then learn is that in addition to the end user, which is unequivocal, has to be there, you need to be engaged with the wider procurement process. And as I'm sure is the case in the US and many nations in the UK, that is a really siloed process. So the end user is not the person with the checkbook, they're not the person defining the future procurement requirements. So you need to plug into those capability areas, you need to plug into those procurement areas. And that's what we try and do from the beginning. And then when we get to the end of the pilot, if it has been successful, hopefully we have an end user that's really happy and really enthusiastic and pulling for it. We have a capability area that's aware that this is on the horizon, has had that in their minds. But then, even then, you hit the slow turning cogs of the bigger machine, and we have now developed a methodology of providing bridge funding. So whilst those cogs turn and you get the business case through and the funding aligned and all of those things sorted, and the larger scale scrutiny that's required for a bigger procurement, we provide the bridge funding to cover that. I would say some of this stuff is, I think all of that fundamentally will stay the same. We're currently at a phase where we're restructuring both the MOD, but also the innovation ecosystem that sits on top of the MOD. So there will be like small changes, but for the most part, that will always stay the same. And I think to your part, the lessons learned of procuring is, one, requiring that user input is vital. And I think it is a really luxurious access that we have. Every startup that I meet says, oh, all I want is access to a user to feedback. And I'm like, yeah, that would be great. But the problem is that's not something that is resourced for. And to your point earlier, you're like, our procurement process, but also not just the process, but all of the personnel job descriptions are built around a system that used to send out a requirement into the ether of industry and wait for people to reply back with what they've got. There's no stage in the process and there's no resource against users going out to industry to explain their needs or the nuance of what would add value to them. That doesn't exist. So wherever that is happening, it's done through goodwill. And that means it's probably not done in a uniform or efficient way. It's done in bits and bobs all over the place, which kind of brings me to the point of, I think, to understand how, and I'm just going to generalize and assume that a lot of other government defense departments have similar restrictions. There are three things that I think make defense a really awkward customer, which we are for the most part. I know. One is the rapidly changing and evolving requirements, you know, particularly now with so much happening all around the world, what we need, how we need it to work, what we need it to integrate with, what we need it to be defensible against, changes daily. And so sometimes we can start a procurement on something and mid-procurement work out that actually what we need is different. Or so that is really awkward and not something that I think a lot of customers have to do. The second is we're working, and I guess this taps into this community a little bit more, like it's a super bureaucratic process, and there are processes that are built for years and years and have slowly evolved, but more likely they've slowly just collected more and more into them, so they've become more and more burdensome. I would say at the very foundation of them, and sometimes you find in the innovation community, people want to just not listen to any of the rules and just throw them all out the window. But you've got to remember, you're working on national security and defense and spending public money. There are some rules that need to exist, but what we need is the ability to navigate through those to understand like what is essential and needs to be managed and what can be bent or put to one side for certain purposes. And I think that brings me on to the third point, which is resource. We don't have enough people, and we're a very finite number of some of the right people. So trying to find, one of the biggest restrictions we've had historically has been our commercial resource, which are the people that navigate the commercial policy for procurement. And if we only have a few of them, they're trying to manage a ton of work. They don't have the time to like pull apart the threads of the bureaucracy to try and navigate new routes. So I think those are the things that, I think there's a lot of willing on both sides, but I think it's a tricky area to navigate.
Yeah, and I think the thing I'll add to that is what we find at DIANA, talking with the startups, is they, we, to your point, want to get access to, to the end users to look at, but every startup wants that. And so even within DIANA, even once you've gotten within the program, you need structures in place to actually have those end users engage, because, and I think this was a change for me coming from a private sector kind of employment mindset. Like public sector employees very much see the requirement to kind of manage their time in a lot of cases, I think, especially in military structures. And so it's very hard to just say, oh, like, come check out this thing, or what do you think about this? It's like people feel like they need a mandate. So I think a lot of what, and jHub, we learned a lot from jHub, I have to say, is providing that. That's why I like the term dialogue, competitive dialogue, because it's providing a formal structure to even have informal conversations, because otherwise there is no venue to do that. So the bottom line, I think, is there's a lot moving in the right direction. I do think, and maybe this is what to end on for our perspective, I'll say from DIANA perspective, I don't know, but it sounds like you have a little bit of the same perspective. There is still the issue that for all we're talking about, if you look at the OTAs, and we'll see what happens with the Secretary's acquisition reforms in the US. If you pull out and look at the pie chart, we're talking about right now a very small sliver of the pie going to all of this effort for innovation. And a lot of that pie is still already cooked or baked. I don't know, yeah, there's a bad analogy. It's already committed. It's funding that's already committed to a lot of existing programs. So when you looked at that defense spending chart and those, the billions in the US, a very small sliver of that is actually available to be committed to future programs. And so I do think that's the other less fun piece, is even if we get this amazing process and this, you still need to then figure out how do you pull resource back or shift resource from the existing stuff where there's a lot of expectation, the contracts are already signed, to the innovative solutions.
So with that, if I could, before we turn it over to Luke, to talk about the UK experience, just wondering if I could follow up with you, Alex, on that. The US experience with the user interaction you've been talking about. And one of the rules in Washington is we're not supposed to do policy by anecdote, but I'm going to break the rule just for a second. The Army Times did a study that half of the U.S. soldiers who are being deployed abroad, in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, were actually buying their own boots. They're buying them on the open market, and they're allowed to do that. They're allowed to buy their own boots. But that was because of a failure on the part of the Army procurement folks to have enough user interaction. What is it that soldiers, to survive, soldiers want good boots. They were willing to spend their own, and they don't earn a lot of money. They're willing to spend that money on boots in order to make it a survivable deployment. And the way that the response in the U.S. was, the U.S. government has opened the door to using Amazon for government purchases, and which is great if you want to buy boots, but you can't buy weapon systems from Amazon. So the stress that you're talking about, the need to interact with users and the need to be able to accommodate alternative solutions, something we're very profoundly aware of. I mean, you can see the procurement system sort of cracking at the margins, and that's where we're going to, and that's why we're here today. Do you want to?
I think we'll have a. So I think why don't we move on to Luke, and then we'll circle around with it. There's questions at the end. I think Ryan agrees with everything we just said.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm late to the game, everyone.
Thank you, Ryan. So with that, if we could go on to Luke's presentation.
Hello.
Can you hear us?
Can everybody hear me? Yes, excellent, thank you. Well, I'll take a step back and look at the UK perspective at a sort of macro level. I've organised this presentation into three themes that I think are emerging, at least from a defence industrial strategy perspective. So the first is centralisation, the second is localisation, and the third is regulation, and that chimes with some of the statements made in the previous presentation. We need to cut a lot of stuff, but we have cut stuff. So the UK's ambition is that it will be at the leading edge of defence innovation in NATO. It's a very bold claim to make. The idea is at a strategic level that we put innovation at the heart of the engine for growth. So we've got a renewed industrial strategy. The idea is that we're going to capitalise on our defence expenditure to renew our domestic industries in various ways. Innovation is going to be a driver for economic growth. So that supports the statement. Defence must recognise innovation as a capability in its own right. We're not just buying things that might be innovative. We're looking to achieve innovation across the entirety of the life cycle of something. And for that to attract private and other investment. A particular pivot for us is recognition that much of the best innovation is found in the civil sector, so dual use capability, and that now is feeding through to regulation, right down to how we define a defence and security contract under our new rules. and the flexibilities that come with that. In our strategic defence review, we were making reference to creating a rapid, continual cycle of innovation between industry and the front line. So, first point is we've got very noble objectives to achieve significant innovation. The real issue, however, is that of budget resourcing. So, we were supposed to see our defence investment plan published in autumn. As you can tell from my terrible cold, it's actually meteorological winter now, and the defence investment plan still hasn't been published. We had a spending review that confirmed the Ministry of Defence research and development budget of more than £2 billion in 2026 to 27, rising for a period of 10 years. We've also got a ring-fenced annual UK DI budget of at least £400 million. The idea is that there will be a priority of Ministry of Defence equipment procurement spend of at least 10% plus on novel technologies, so uncrewed autonomous systems, dual use, underpinned by AI-enabled capabilities. Now, from an outsider's perspective, when I look at the metrics for this, how do we actually measure what innovation is going to look like and what are we going to get out of it? It's very difficult to discern how the UK is going to measure innovation. The Defence Industrial Strategy only identifies two things in the strategy. The first is that by 2035, there will be lots of MOD spend in the rapid commercial exploitation procurement segment. So we're going to adopt a new approach to our procurement models called segmented procurement. One segment of that is rapid commercial exploitation of procurement. We're going to procure in 3-month cycles certain material, with a focus on uncrewed systems, drones, and digital software. That's great. Let's see if things are procured and ready for deployment within 3 months. The second, only other mention, is to increase the number of SMEs and non-traditional suppliers that are involved in Ministry of Defence innovation programmes. There's a serious question mark about whether that's actually realistic. So for at least 10 years, maybe less, the Ministry of Defence has had a target of ensuring 25% of all spend will be with SMEs. That has never happened. At most, we've probably got about 4% of direct spend with SMEs in real terms. And that raises a wider question of how do we effectively get SMEs and non-traditional suppliers on board? We've already mentioned some of the difficulties of actually targeting the user community, making sure those interactions work, and that suppliers are aware of how they actually break into the market. We've got no particularly significant developed strategies for preliminary market engagement, other than we intend to facilitate it. And there's legal rules that do facilitate that, but there's not necessarily the processes in place to achieve it. One theme that emerges for me is increasing centralisation in various forms. So there's reliance on NATO-led innovation funding. This is referenced in the strategic and defence industry reviews. Ministry of Defence has already seen significant success in accelerating dual-use technology development and pull-through, for example, in things like clean technology, and significant support from the Defence and Security Accelerator that I'll mention again in a moment, so DASA, and there is reference to the establishment of NATO DIANA and the NATO Innovation Fund. There are some statistics or figures in the document. So in 2024 alone, UK DI DASA-funded firms raised 174 million. DASA finds and funds innovation in various ways. In May 2025, less significant in terms of numbers, even things like Space Forge raised 22.6 million, and the NATO Innovation Fund has led the round on that. We also have NATO DIANA, that's identified various initiatives, and we're seeing some of the UK-specific accelerators feeding into the NATO DIANA initiatives. Those have been listed on various websites. We're also seeing a centralisation now of the various defence innovation bodies in the UK scope for defence. So we've created UK DI, which unites DASA, a Defence Innovation Unit, Command Innovation Hubs, and Defence Equipment Support Future Capability Innovation. Now, okay, we've centralised all of these various bodies into one capability, but there's various sources, including things like the Industry Association, ADS, has said, okay, we've got a patchwork of innovation initiatives, but ultimately the true test is how will any of this be properly coordinated into initiatives that work? So we've got lots of bodies coming together. Will that singularity actually prove to be effective. We've got a UK DI Rapid Innovation Unit on the way that will enable defence to innovate at wartime pace by leveraging commercially available dual-use technology to address Ministry of Defence's most urgent capability requirements. Now, it's said that UK DI will have radical freedoms and independence from standard Ministry of Defence procurement rules and flexibilities. But an interesting point that I would raise is actually under our new regulations, under the Procurement Act, we've got significant regulatory flexibility now. Anyway, it's not the case that we need significant streamlining of innovation processes because there's not that much regulation in place. It depends how we define regulation, but certainly legal rules are not a major barrier to doing innovative defence procurement. In addition to this centralisation of innovation functions, we also have increasing localisation. So we're trying to develop defence capability across the UK, not just in one particular place. Going for this across the board. So the UK has developed defence for growth deals to develop innovation and investment across a number of regions. There have been a number of examples. I think there are 6 focal points. One is in Plymouth, so in relation to anything naval, which will include strengthening local skills initiatives, focusing on STEM outreach in fields such as electrical engineering, renewable energy systems, nuclear operations and autonomy, and driving innovation through the Advanced Marine Technology Hub for dual-use capability innovation. So there will be targeted funding directed at particular regions that are designed to develop regional economies through various types of initiatives. The final thing that I wanted to mention was regulation. So the UK Defence Industrial Strategy is rather vague on this, but it says it is going to streamline the regulatory environment in various ways that remove barriers to innovation. And this is to support the Prime Minister's target to reduce the administrative cost of regulation by 25%. There are all sorts of things that are being identified, creations of regulatory solutions hubs, reducing the operation of defence contract conditions that can sometimes be a prohibitive inhibitor to innovation when they're being imported into contracts, providing for streamlined approaches to test and evaluation, and aligning the way in which test and evaluation strategies work alongside various regulators. So one example is the Defence Marine Regulator. So streamlining the rules. In addition to streamlining the regulatory environment generally, we also have streamlined procedures introduced into the Procurement Act 2023. There is now extensive flexibility. We've left the European Union, we've adopted a new set of procurement rules. We're no longer constrained by very restrictive procedures. So Tom mentioned the ability to do things like competitive dialogue, etc. Under the EU directives, if we wanted to do innovation, there were obstacles to doing it. We could procure R&D, but we had to go out to the market and separately procure the commercial output of that R&D. There was an innovation partnership procedure that meant you could bridge the two. But it's very convoluted. We've got rid of that. Now there are no procedures. If you're within the Ministry of Defence, you can simply devise a procedure that works for you. So you can devise an innovative procedure. That should allow for more flexible negotiations, more by way of dialogue, fewer legal constraints. Also, we've got more flexible rules on direct awards and contract modifications. So you can simply modify a contract for the purposes of maintaining your technological advantage. And that will be subject to very few constraints on the exercise of your discretion. The other thing to note is that under the EU rules, dual-use technologies were excluded from the concept of a defence and security contract. So if you wanted to procure dual-use, you had to use the civil directives, or you'd have difficulty relying on the flexibilities of the defence rules because dual-use was excluded. Now dual-use contracts are included within the definition of a defence and security contract. So as soon as you can identify something as dual use, there aren't many tests to go through to show whether it's dual use or whether it's for military application. If you could say it's clearly dual use, it falls within the flexibilities of the defence and security rules now. So that unlocks a lot of flexibility in the system. So we've got reduced regulation, but I appreciate there's a lot of regulatory and policy barriers that stand in the way in MOD commercial processes that have to be streamlined in addition to this in order to provide for a more innovative environment. So at least 3 themes I think that are emerging from the UK experience. We'll see how all of this works once it's all properly funded. Thank you.
Oh, and you're on mute in the London office.
Can you hear me okay, Luke?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
So the reason I'm so glad you could join us, Luke, is because the unique position that the United Kingdom has, you can write law much faster than the European Union, in fact, much faster than the United States can. So what we're seeing here is the United Kingdom demonstrating as the fastest lawmaker, so fastest law writer, demonstrating these important innovations in the law and approaches to procurement. I just want to wrap up with a couple of questions. Ryan was able to join us, and we just had a question for her perspectives from the user community and from someone who's actively working on these innovations, procurement for innovation. Ryan, you had experience as a U.S. Navy officer. How does that experience compare now that you're working in a European and a NATO environment? How would you compare those two experiences?
Thank you. Thanks for giving me the floor. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Benitez. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer here at NATO DIANA. Served 9 years as a U.S. Navy officer and took a break to the private sector, still within defense innovation, and now find myself back in NATO. And in truth, I do see a lot of similarities that, we can talk about the pros and the cons. I think the cons are just like, anything procurement, there's always practice, procedure, and policies that have to be followed. The unique thing that I have found with NATO is that it is quite formal, and you're dealing, with the consensus of 32 nations. But one similar thing of hope that I see is that, similar to the U.S., that has come a long way with its SBIR program, then moving on to open topic and really being forward-leaning with OTAs. I think now we're starting to see that same momentum and learnings trickle over to the European front and over to NATO. Tom, I'm sure you already talked about RAS, plenty here, but we see NATO nations coming to the table, especially those that maybe have less developed acquisition systems, or they just want to be at the forefront of having streamlined prototyping pathways. They are leaning into this RAS that we have built up. So the similarity across US and NATO has really, in the US, we see KOs being now more forward-leaning on using OTAs, and this SBIR phase 3 authority. There's more of a mindset shift that I've seen within the US the past 5 years, and now I really see that trickling over here to the European side. So a lot of great momentum and good things happening.
Thank you very much. For our non-American audience, the SBIR is a Small Business Innovation Research program. It's analogous to innovation partnerships here in the European Union, and the OTAs, which is what Tom was talking about when we were talking about before, Other Transaction Authority. It's the common acronym for other transactions. Ed, did you have any comments you wanted to add?
Thanks, Chris, Professor Yukins. Folks, this has been absolutely fascinating, and thank you for those who have taken time to talk it through today. From the Google Cloud side of the fence, I suppose we're one of the many technology innovators out there and one of the potential suppliers to the public sector, and we're keen to be growing, particularly our partnership with global and particularly NATO defense allies. I think one reflection I had listening to what was being discussed is that there's certainly been historically unwelcome degrees of rigidity in procurement processes themselves for innovation. But the other side to that coin, and others who are wiser than I am have already outlined why that landscape is improving for everyone. But the other side of the coin that I wanted to shine a light on, to mix my metaphor, is once a public body like a NATO buying entity or any other type of public body has successfully run one of these more agile R&D type procurements, and they've selected a supplier that can deliver something that meets their needs. The other challenge that we certainly encounter on the Google Cloud side is, how do the customer and supplier in that relationship balance ongoing innovation? In other words, if on the 1st of December 2025, we can prove that Google Cloud and some of our DeepMind technologies are perfect to meet needs A, B, and C, what happens in February next year when we launch our new, not yet known about technologies that will be potentially very helpful, potentially very innovative, but are different from the conversations that took place in the previous year? And there's no easy answer to that challenge. I mean, well, I have an easy answer, but it's not an answer which I think a lot of public bodies can always legally contract for. But it's around, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is we need to bridge the gap, not only in terms of the way we make procurement protocols more agile, but contracting protocols need to be more agile to allow innovative improvement in the services once they have begun to be delivered. That's just sort of my 2 cents there. And I have mixed a lot of metaphors, Professor Yukins. Please forgive me.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay, Ed?
Absolutely.
I think we're gonna close out. I want to thank the audience very much. We had a little bit of glitch with some users being able to access, but we'll solve that by having everybody join Google Meet tomorrow. Thank you very much for your help with that, Ed. And I want to thank Tom and his crew here for their flexibility and their generosity in hosting this. We're looking forward to our conversations tomorrow in Paris, and then on Friday in Milan. Tomorrow we'll be joined with an official from the OECD to talk about global developments. We'll also be talking about the European investment banks' use of their use of what will loosely be termed public-private partnerships for defense and security contracts. So moving forward in the same vein. And I especially want to thank Cheryl Blake, who's here with me. You can't see her, but Cheryl is a U.S. Air Force major. She's a student in our program, an LM candidate, and I've been very, very grateful. As you may have seen on camera, we've been dealing with a lot of email questions, and I very much appreciate her patience and support. With that, we'll close out. And again, thank you all.